Welcome, everyone, to the Weinberg Group webinar entitled Taking Full Advantage of the 505(b)(2) NDA Pathway. All participant lines will be in a listen-only mode throughout the call. However, if you would like to submit a question or comment to the presenters, click on the button marked Ask a Question on your event window and submit your question. All questions will be answered via email within a week of the presentation. To start, I will turn the conference over to Mr. Antos. Thank you, sir. You may begin.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. I'm Jeff Antos from the Weinberg Group, and I'll be moderating today's session entitled Taking Full Advantage of the 505(b)(2) NDA Pathway. The Weinberg Group is a regulatory and scientific consulting firm serving pharma, biotech, and device clients. We're based in Washington, D.C. Our speaker, Joel Falk, Weinberg Group Executive Vice President, leads our product regulation and compliance practice and has spent his entire career in the pharma business holding executive management positions at a number of major pharmas, including Lederle, Knoll, Besselar, Rhone-Poulenc, Sanofi, and In Vivo. Joel's comments today are based on many years of global drug development experience. I will now turn the presentation over to Joel.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. As you see, we're talking about the 505(b)(2) today, and just wanted to bring to you some basics about the 505(b)(2) pathway and its ability to be a very strong regulatory strategy for some of your products. This is a pathway to approval that has, as I say here in this overview, has the potential to optimally limit the need for specific information that hopefully would be to benefit your companies. Specifically, we're talking about toxicity data and perhaps even some of the more costly and time-consuming extensive human safety data that would be required in order to approve some of these products. So the benefits for the 505(b)(2) then become very obvious in terms of hopefully lowering cost and perhaps shortening the development time. It's interesting now that in the years that the 505(b)(2) has really been utilized, that both large and small pharmaceutical companies have been taking advantage of this pathway. And as we start looking at some of the issues around the 505(b)(2), the major questions that everyone needs to ask themselves is, what am I going to need to do in order to succeed at this, and how is it, and what are the things that I need to avoid in order to make sure that I do succeed and not fail? So today, what we're going to do is discuss some of these issues that I have here. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the definitions of these pathways and how they compare one to the other. We'll look a little bit at the process of pursuing the 505(b)(2), some of the regulatory and legal issues that you need to be aware of. I think one issue, and we'll talk a little bit about this, would be some issues around exclusivity for a product that does follow this 505(b)(2) strategy. What data would be required in order to be successful? And we'll talk a little bit about the comparative costs between the 505(b)(2) and some of the other pathways. And we'll look a little bit at the major elements that you need to consider as you move forward with this process. So just to begin and just to get a little bit of perspective on this, the methods that you would use, and I think all of you know these pathways, under Section 505 in the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, there are essentially three ways to get your drugs approved, and that would be through the 505(b)(1), the (b)(2), and the 505(j), which is a generic ANDA type submission. Under Section 505(b), and this is the first approval process we'll talk about, is the 505(b)(1), but under Section 505(b), which does provide for an NDA, a new drug application, to support the approval of a product, of a drug product. This is the classical full NDA. And for those of you that are developing new chemical entities, these are products, obviously, for which the agency has not really passed any kind of review on that product. And as such, the onus for reporting is really, the standard is really very high. So in order to get through the 505(b)(1), you're going to be required to do complete reporting on issues like non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology. What is it that the product has shown in animal models, and have you tested the toxicity of this product in these animal models? We need to look at clinical pharmacology. Again, very importantly, we need to look at clinical investigations, and obviously the prime movers for an approval would be the demonstration of safety and efficacy. And all throughout this, you need to be able to be very precise in describing and reporting to the agency the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls information about the product. What exactly is the product? How can you characterize it? What are the manufacturing processes, and how do you control that process to assure that you're making the product the same way and you're getting the same drug every time you do that? And again, these are studies that are generally conducted by you, the innovator or the sponsor of that product. The 505(b)(2), and we'll talk about that now, is again a full NDA. It's intended to encourage companies to innovate new products, but not necessarily to create additional work. And we'll talk a little bit about the 505J in a second, but it reflects the same principles as you would see with a generic application. We don't necessarily want to ask companies to carry out unnecessary studies to demonstrate what we already know, and by we meaning the FDA, what the FDA already knows about a particular drug product. The one difference here that I just want to point out is that in most cases, a 505(b)(2), different from the ANDA, would not necessarily yield an AB rating, which would mean that the product would not necessarily be interchangeable with the innovator or the known active ingredient. But in some cases, it actually could be, but those are fairly rare. Some more basics about the 505(b)(2), and again, I mentioned this before, it is a full NDA, and by that I mean that it would be subject to the same kind of submission as the 505(b)(1), and as you all know, this would be through a common technical document, the CTD, which contains 5 separate modules covering all of the different aspects of that the agency would like to know about with your product. So it still is, even though the numbers of studies may actually be somewhat truncated, the need for providing a common technical document is still the same. It's still a full NDA. Some elements that you need to consider here is that the product still needs to be the same active product or API as the 505(b)(1) approved innovator product. The reporting requirements for the 505(b)(2) would include a report of what we already know, the previously reported safety and effectiveness information, and normally this would be information from studies that were not conducted by you as the applicant. We're going to rely on the FDA's review of these prior products and their determinations of the safety and efficacy from other NDAs that have passed in front of these divisions. And that would go for both non-clinical studies as well as clinical work. It's also important to understand here that this would only be true for information for which you do not have a right of reference. If you do have the right of reference, then you need to provide that. And then with regards to the 505(b)(2), you can change certain things from the innovator, which is different from the ANDA, but new studies would be required within the NDA to support that change. And those studies may certainly be aimed at providing safety and effectiveness related to the change. And it might be an indication, it might be something else. The kinds of products then that would be allowed under the 505(b)(2, we're going to go through those here. These would be products that have changes to previously approved drugs, again, these innovator drugs, and the changes might include issues like differences in dose regimen. It may be a slight change in the API where you're changing the salt or the ester or some other aspect of the drug, but again, the basic same active product. It may be a new indication for which you can utilize an innovator product that has not been previously approved for that indication. It could be used for an issue where you're taking a prescription product to an OTC. It could be for a product that is bio-inequivalent to an innovator product, but not necessarily have inferior bioavailability compared to the innovator or the reference-listed drug. It also should have formulation changes that would be outside of the 505J limits, which again, the 505J is the generic, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a second. And it cannot, well, and here's the second, it cannot be used for products that would be eligible for an ANDA. So if your product qualifies as being bioequivalent to a reference-listed product and there are no other changes, then you would have to follow the ANDA or the 505J route. Some products that are not allowed under the 505(b)(2), and that's just looking at this in the reverse, is any product that is covered by the 505J statutes. Also, where the only difference in your product to the reference-listed drug is the extent to which the active ingredient that is absorbed is less than the reference-listed drug, or where the only difference is that the rate that the active ingredient is absorbed is actually unintentionally less than the reference-listed drug. Some 505(b)(2) examples, routes of administration, where the routes of administrations have changed. The 505(b)(2) route is a good way to look at this. So it could be from an IV to other parenteral routes. It could be, again, where the active ingredient has been changed slightly. Again, where you have a new molecular entity where it's a prodrug of an approved product or an active metabolite of an approved drug. These are products that could be used. It could be a new combination where combining actives that have been previously approved have been put together. The data that have been identified as usable and approved for each of the individual combinations could then be used. And again, formulation changes where perhaps excipients are being used that are not allowed under the 505J, you could then use as a 505(b)(2). Where you're changing dosage form, where you're going from an oral, and there are some examples of that, an oral to a transdermal, where you're looking at deliveries, where you go from an immediate release to an extended release, and in some of the different forms of dermal applications where you're looking at lotions to foams, this is a good way to get those products approved. Dosage strength, where you're going higher or lower, but again, if you go higher than what the reference-listed drug is, you're going to be subject to additional studies. The other would be where you're changing the regimen from perhaps twice daily to once daily. Those types of issues could be subject to 505(b)(2) approval route. So now, what is the ANDA? And I don't want to spend too much time on this because we want to talk really more about the 505(b)(2). But again, this is the generic application. It is an abbreviated type of application that generally does not include the need for any additional preclinical or clinical data to establish safety or effectiveness. The generic applicants, however, must demonstrate that the product that they are testing is bioequivalent and that it performs in the same manner and is essentially comparable to the innovator product in all ways. So we're looking at the ingredient, the form, the strength, the route of administration, and so on. And I think it's best to look at this in terms of labeling. If you can utilize an innovator's label and make it your own, then it probably should be a generic product. The 505J applications, again, these products are the same as the listed drug and identical in active ingredient, form, strength, administration, and identical in the conditions of use. Again, remember, we're copying the innovator's label. There's a clause here concerning non-exclusive uses. Some companies have determined that their generic may actually have some value beyond that which the innovator has obtained an approval. Those non-exclusive uses would not be allowed under the generic. They would be required to do studies and would be subject to different application. However, you can also look at products for an ANDA that would be declared suitable based on a petition, a suitability petition to the FDA regarding your reasons why you think this should be a generic. Drug products are okay for a suitability petition. They can also always be submitted as a 505(b)(2), but you need to consider, and this would be on an individual basis for these products, the pros and the cons of pursuing either a 505J for these products or a 505(b)(2). And there are some differences and there are some benefits to each one. So some of the benefits we should probably talk about, or at least the differences. The first one is fairly interesting here in terms of exclusivity, and many of you know this already, but for the ANDA, if you are the first to file for a generic utilizing a paragraph 4 certification, which essentially says that you can adequately show that you are not violating or infringing on an innovator's patent, you will then be granted 180 days of exclusivity before any other generic can come out. So that would be the best exclusivity that you could expect going the 505J or the ANDA route. For a 505(b)(2), for filings that would require essential clinical data, you would then receive for your product 3 years of exclusivity in addition to the patent protection that you would already have for your product, or you would hopefully have for your product. And again, the patent protection is not really an issue under the ANDA because you're copying an innovator product, so you're certifying that there is no patent. But I think the exclusivity is a fairly compelling reason to think about the 505(b)(2). The types of data that would be required for each of these pathways, in terms of chemistry and manufacturing, obviously the analytical information on chemistry on the CMC data would be required for both different strategies, In terms of stability, obviously stability is necessary. However, for an ANDA, the stability time that you would need would be 3 months of real-time stability on a single batch and 3 months of accelerated stability. For a 505(b)(2) NDA, this is a little more stringent, where you would need 12 months of real-time on 3 batches and 6 months of accelerated. In terms of safety data, again, remember for the ANDA, you're required to show that your product is bioequivalent. Once you do that, you're pretty much approved. So there's no real requirement for additional safety data. However, for 505(b)(2), where there are some changes from the original innovator drug, safety data would be required, and really the extent of that safety data would be dependent upon your product. For efficacy data, again, the same reasoning as we had before for the safety data. For the ANDA, it's not required for the ANDA. It is required for a 505(b)(2), and the patent certification is required for the ANDA and for the 505(b)(2). PK data, again, for an ANDA, this is really the crux of the submission, but at a minimum, you're going to need a single-dose fasting bioequivalence study, as well as, in many cases, a single-dose fed BE study. In some cases, it's not necessary. For the 505(b)(2), again, you're going to have to do a minimum of a single-dose fasted BE. I think almost always you would need to do a food effect study and also a multiple-dose steady-state study, especially when you're looking at modified release products. Almost always you're going to need to do a multiple-dose steady-state study. In terms of labeling, again, as we had mentioned before, the 505J, the ANDA, really is required to use the same labeling as the reference listed drug, and you are not going to be allowed to list any exclusive indications. For the 505(b)(2), it could be similar to the RLD, especially if the changes are small but the bioequivalence isn't there. But you also now can, looking at this as an NDA and looking at the studies that you're submitting, you can include some of the unique data that you are generating, as well as have indications that may differ from the RLD, which is normally the reason why you're following this pathway. I wanted to take just a second and just summarize some of the 3 pathways, and I've put these in an order of what I think is the easiest or the less onerous to the more demanding type of submission. So we're looking at ANDA, 505(b)(2), and then 505(b)(1). In terms of formulation work, I mean, you really need to do formulation work for all 3 of these pathways. In terms of the preclinical tox, as we've said before, there's not a need to do any additional preclinical tox work for the ANDA. In some cases, there may be some need to do additional preclinical tox for 505(b)(2)s. We've been in situations where the divisions that we've talked to have stated that for the reference listed drug, there's been a lack of information in the past on tox, and have asked sponsor companies to see if they can fill in the blanks. But so sometimes there's a need to do a little bit of tox work, and I think usually for a 505(b)(1 is an understatement. I'm pretty sure always that would be necessary. In terms of manufacturing stability and control types information, that's going to be required for all 3 pathways. The next item, the FDA meeting, a pre-IND or even a pre-IND meeting, this is important if you want to get real feedback from the agency, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Under the 505J, there's no real provision for discussing this with the agency, and there's really not a lot of interest on the part of the agency to have these types of meetings. But with the 505B2 and the 505B1, absolutely, I think they're very important. And I think for the 505B2, which is what we're really focusing on here today, identifying with the agency what it is you plan on doing, but also getting their buy-in on the strategy is important up front so that you're not really going down a path that the agency doesn't agree with. So I think it's important to have that FDA meeting. The PK studies and I think will be necessary for all three of the pathways. Clinical trials, there's something that's going to be needed in all of them. It could be a PD study required with topical product, and I think these are going to be dependent upon the type of drug and what really needs to be proven. For the FDA meeting, a pre-NDA meeting, again, there's nothing for the ANDA, but again, you have the ability to get input from the agency at the time prior to the NDA, which I think is important for both the 505B2 and 505B1. Obviously, there's a submission for each one. User fees, nothing for the ANDA yet, and there are user fees for the 505B2 and B1 applications. The exclusivity, again, for the ANDA, maybe, and that's if you are the first, and usually you're going to have exclusivity if you follow the 505B routes to B2 and B1. I also wanted to talk a little bit about really the effort involved. I see a typo here where we're talking about three pathways. We're really only comparing the two. But for the BE studies, and these are very, very general type numbers, for the ANDA, what you're looking at is probably about a 4 to 6 month period of time to carry out your bioequivalence studies. These studies, and this may be an underestimation in some cases of some of the types of BE studies, depending upon the procedures that need to be run in the analysis, the cost of the analysis, but we're talking usually between $50,000 and $750,000. To put together the submission and make that submission takes usually 1 to 2 months to do. In some cases, it may be really simple. In some cases, it may take a little bit longer, but again, I think 1 to 2 months is a fair estimate. The time to approval is interesting. There's really no mandate on this. We've seen these kind of languish recently and have gone out to 1.5 years, and in some cases, a little bit longer. There's a little more certainty, I think, in the 505B2 route. Now, in terms of the clinical trials, again, this is really dependent upon the product that you're testing and the indication, but these trials could take anywhere between 12 and 24 months to accomplish. It could be somewhere between $2 million and greater than 10, and again, depends upon the complexity of the trials and the number of subjects that you're going to need in order to prove your point. The BE studies really are pretty much the same as those for the ANDA. The submission could take 1 to 2 months, but again, that's really going to be dependent upon how proactive you are in making putting that together. But again, for the NDA, you're going to be required to do an electronic submission. There's probably some time you need to add to that to make sure that the conversion is done appropriately. The time to approval, which I had mentioned before, is a little bit more consistent and a little bit more reliable, is that the time to approval could be 10 months. Now, that would be 10 months to an action, meaning that the FDA could come back and say that you're not necessarily going to be approved, but at least within 10 months you will know. Hopefully, based on your data, you would have a good idea as to whether or not you're going to get through or not anyway. So now I'd like to talk about the process and the elements of the 505(b)(2) process specifically, and what needs to be done, and hopefully what would help you be successful in pursuing this. And a lot of these elements you can apply to other types of applications, but I'd like to stick to the 505(b)(2). So the major elements, what makes up the 505(b)(2) approach, really is all in meetings and materials. So the meetings that you would be allowed to have or can get for certain would be the pre-IND meeting, an end of phase 2 meeting, and a pre-NDA or pre-BLA, depending upon your product. We'll talk just a little bit about that in a second. And those are the meetings. Now, you can get individual meetings depending upon issues that come up during the development, but these are the mainstays for meetings with the agency. And again, the types of submissions that you would be doing would be very simply the IND and also an NDA. And then I think another part of all of this, another element, would be developing a strong relationship with the division you're dealing with and having good, solid interactions with that division. It is important not to surprise the agency, and it's important for you not to be surprised by anything that the agency says back to you. So in terms of the individual meeting, so the pre-IND meeting is a Type B meeting, and the first aspect of this is really the preparation of a good, solid briefing package. This briefing package is your ability to present all of the information that you have on this product and is formulating your reason for moving forward in a certain way. So you're going to have the opportunity now to present your scientific rationale based on information that you have. The briefing package should be very, very clearly stating all of that information. This is also an opportunity in this briefing package to explain how you come to the 505(b)(2) strategy and give them enough information to assure them that this is a wise way to go and gain their buy-in on the types of materials and the amount of information that they will accept from other submissions. And as you probably all know and have gone to the agency before, this meeting, this pre-IND meeting, is really based on questions that you develop and want to get answers from the agency. And these questions really need to be very precise and focused. We have seen in a number of instances where the questions that are being asked are fairly open-ended, and what the answers are that come back are somewhat ambiguous and perhaps not very helpful. But the briefing package, again, is extremely important. I can't stress that enough. I think this is your chance to tell them everything so that they have enough information to have a good conversation with you at the meeting, and they have all of the information that they need. Moving to the end of phase 2 meeting, this is an opportunity for you to present to the agency your phase 2 data, and obviously then to obtain some agreement concerning the phase 3 program. Now, the phase 3 program, again, as you probably know, is comprised of your pivotal trials, and it's really important to get an understanding of what the agency will accept. I think the worst answer that any company can get from the agency, if you can't if you can't agree on anything, is to have them say, you can go ahead and do this, but it's going to be a review issue at the time of the NDA. You really want to get a little bit more certainty, so you'd like to be able to show them reasonable phase 2 data and obtain a solid answer as to what they really think about your phase 3 program. And then also at this meeting, you can either begin or hopefully continue discussion on certain other aspects of the drug development and the regulatory strategy. Things like CMC issues can be discussed, as well as other issues, and I've just listed one here. That would be whether or not there are going to be pediatric requirements, so that you can consider those as you move forward and you can file your NDA on time. And then finally, the pre-NDA or the pre-BLA meeting, which again is a Type B meeting. This is an opportunity now to present your phase 3 data, review any of the lingering CMC issues, and then also to discuss the content and perhaps things that the FDA would like to see in the NDA that might be somewhat different. So some of the things that you need to keep in mind as you're preparing for any of these meetings is that, and I think this is just such an obvious comment, but a lot of people need to hear it again, is that the success of your meeting is going to really depend and be directly related to the quality of the preparation you put into it. The briefing packages, again, they need to be very clear, concise, they need to be very understandable, and you're really not doing yourself a favor if you're vague in these, because the agency is using that information to draw some conclusion and draw responses to your specific questions. So you really need to be very upfront and present as clear a picture of your information as possible. And, here I'm just saying be prepared. There's no substitute for a lack of preparation. It just doesn't work. So you need to understand the FDA and what they may actually, how they might respond to your specific issues. So try to anticipate the FDA responses to your questions even before you receive the official FDA response. Our experience here, although we've been told that people get these responses a week ahead of time, ahead of the meeting, we have on occasion, if we're lucky, we get them the day before the meeting, and in some cases we've actually gotten the responses in the morning before we go to the meeting. So you really need to think about how the FDA is going to react and respond to some of the issues and questions that you've put in front of them. As you start talking with the agency and you receive their specific responses, if the response that they give you to a particular question or issue is clear and understandable, there's really no need to pursue it any further. However, if it's unclear, it is your responsibility really to clear that up and make sure that you get an unambiguous answer. You're not going to get too many opportunities after this to talk to the agency about these specific questions. So make sure that you're getting, again, an unambiguous answer from the agency. Have a strategy. When you go to this meeting, there are a number of things that you can do to make sure that you're approaching this meeting in the right way. You need to know all of the attendees. You need to know your group. I think everyone in your group representing your company and your product, every one of these representatives needs to have a very, very specific purpose to be at the meeting, and make sure that everyone there knows what their roles are. You also need to understand who's on the other side of the table. So it's very important for you to understand who the FDA representatives are and what their positions are on certain topics and what their attitudes are to certain issues. It will help you greatly in presenting information that you know these folks want to hear. With regards to your folks attending the meeting, everyone there needs to be assigned some aspect in terms of participating in the meeting. First, there should be someone who's responsible for leading the discussion. Everyone there needs to know who's going to answer certain specific questions and how they should answer it. And also, there needs to be someone who's going to keep the time so that you don't run out of time in these meetings, as well as someone who's responsible for keeping notes and minuting the meeting. Excuse me. You need to take a look at the questions and the responses that you receive back from the agency and make sure that you go into the meeting with a list of the questions that you wish to pursue, and hopefully you have them in some logical order. And normally what we do is take a look at those issues that we want to discuss, which we feel are the most important, and we also want to make sure that we look at those issues that we believe will take up the most time. And decisions need to be made as to how far you pursue certain questions so that you don't run out of time and you get the best answers that you can. I think the next point that I make here is extremely important. There should be no surprises. The divisions at the agency don't necessarily want to entertain any question about information that they have not already received. So make sure that you try to limit your responses to data that they have in their hands and that they have reviewed. They will not comment on anything that they have not had an opportunity to review. The other thing is that there should be no new questions raised. Again, the agency has focused on the questions that you've submitted in the briefing package. And again, I guess I need to go back to the first point, which is to make sure that your briefing package is very clear, concise, and very complete. After the meeting, it's really important to make sure that as soon as you possibly can, that your group debrief to sit down and basically discuss what just happened. So you need to understand also that every person in your group has a particular focus and that they will be focusing on different items within the meeting. So get the input of everybody in the room as to what they believe just happened with that particular meeting. Once you get to the drafting of the meeting minutes, I think everybody should be involved in the drafting of the meeting, either in writing it or in reviewing it, just to make sure that all of the issues of importance are in your minutes. And you should be acting on follow-up issues that are raised at that meeting as soon as possible. The company's meeting minutes we would like to have sent back to the FDA project manager within 48 hours. In some cases, this is rather ambitious, but the point here is that the sooner you get it back to them, I think the better. They have something to look at. They can see, they may even actually use some of these minutes in formulating their responses, their further responses. So it's really important to act quickly on these meeting minutes. And I think it's also important for companies to realize that although you have drawn minutes from the meeting, nothing is official until the FDA has put it in writing in their minutes. And this actually should come back to you within 30 days of the meeting. That's their mandate. I was going to say that we've been seeing the FDA kind of drag that out to as much as 60 days, even with a lot of prodding. But recently, we've seen minutes come back as quickly as 3 and 4 days. So 30 days is still a fair rule of thumb. So in summary, and I think this kind of encapsulates the 505b2 and what it is that you can get out of it. The 505b2 pathway really could be a potentially low-risk regulatory strategy. It has tremendous advantages in terms of time and money, and even perhaps, as we've seen, exclusivity when the choice is between the ANDA and the 505b2. It's an opportunity with the 505b2 to get early FDA feedback. And again, I think this needs to be stressed. I think it's really important to find a way to communicate with the agency on a fairly regular basis and build some level of cooperation with the division. The FDA interactions through the meetings and the materials that you send to them are real keys to success, keeping them informed and making sure that there are no real surprises. And again, I think the issue of having an AB-rated drug is something that needs to be considered, although not necessarily the kind of thing that you might get from the 505b2. You might, but again, it's something that needs to be considered. And with that, I think we are done. Jeff?
Joel, thanks for that. I've got a number of questions here, so let me start out with the first one. When would it be better to file a 505b2 versus a supplemental NDA for your own product with a change?
Well, that's a good question. I think if the product that you're comparing your 505b2 or your next product, if that product was approved under a 505b1 and it's your product, there's really no advantage to filing the 505b2 NDA for the change. You can file a supplement under 505b1, and I think that makes more sense because you won't need to include the patent certifications that are required and so on. I mean, it's already your product. Alternatively, a new 505b1 NDA could be filed and reference the applicable information, such as the farm tox from the original NDA. So I think it really depends. If the innovator product is your own, then I would file the supplement.
Interesting. Okay, good. Thank you. Another question. What are some of the examples of clinical studies done for 505b2 that are beyond bioequivalent studies?
Well, any B2 NDA that's seeking approval for a new indication would require clinical studies to show effectiveness and possibly safety, particularly if the new indication, if the dosing regimen increases the patient's exposure to the active moiety. Clinical studies would depend then on the nature of the change that's covered in the B2 NDA. So, for example, if you're doing an RX to an OTC switch, you might require label recognition studies that involve patients. And those are considered clinical studies, although they might not involve actual administration of the drug product. It would be an additional study.
Okay, great. Thanks. Here's one I haven't thought of before. Can we get more than one pre-IND meeting from the FDA for each phase of clinical study?
No. And that's usually there's only one real pre-IND meeting, and again, that's why it's really important to maximize these meetings. There's only one real chance for the pre-IND, but as I've mentioned here before, there are a number of other places where you can talk to the agency at specified times, things like the end of phase 2 and the pre-NDA. Now, I think I also mentioned that you could get some other meetings, type C meetings, especially if you've got some problem in your development and you really do need FDA input. And I want to stress the fact that you need to really press for these meetings because FDA will grant reasonable meeting requests, it's really not obligated to do that. So you need to prepare the issue and really kind of press for that meeting.
Okay, thanks. Here's a suitability petition question. What's the approval time for a 505B2 NDA versus ANDA submitted under a suitability petition?
Well, let me just limit this answer to the amount of time involved in the FDA review process, because the development times for these two types of applications can vary for a number of reasons. But once submitted, and assuming that all of the required information is included in the 505B2 NDA, is likely really to be a faster route at the FDA, because it's subject to a drug user fee. And those deadlines, are subject and are fairly consistent. The longest deadline is 10 months for the FDA to issue what we had said before was a complete response to an NDA. On the other side, for the ANDA, the approval pathway at the agency for the ANDA submitted under an ANDA suitability petition could be much longer. First thing is that the ANDA suitability petition needs to be reviewed and approved, and the FDA normally gets 90 days to do that. Once that petition is approved, the ANDA referencing the approved petition can then be submitted. And assuming that all of the information required for the NDA is there and included in the original ANDA submission, the current average review length prior to approval by FDA's Office of Generic Drugs, I think I mentioned before, could be greater than 18 months. We've seen as high as 22 months recently. And the reason, I think, is because it's not subject to user fees.
Okay. And speaking of user fees, I got a user fee question. What's the user fee for a 505B2 filing?
Actually, I don't know what they're going to be for 2011. I can tell you now that for applications that have clinical data, that require clinical data, the current user's fee is now $1,400,000. I think it's about $1.4 million, maybe a little bit more. For applications that don't require clinical data, or even for supplements that require a little bit of clinical data, it's half of that, so it's about $702,000 plus for that. Okay, thank you. We got time for a couple more. Interesting question, I think, about the pre-IND meeting as it relates to 505B2, and that is, you mentioned the possibility of a pre-IND meeting for a 505B2 application. Does this mean we have to file an IND prior to conducting the BE study, or can we conduct the BE study and directly request a pre-NDA meeting? Yeah, I think, as we had discussed, I think whether an IND is required for a bioequivalence study it's governed by 21 CFR 320.31, and I think people can go back and look at that. But if an IND is required for a bioequivalence study, a pre-IND meeting may be desired to ensure that the study plan meets FDA requirements. If the B2 NDA contemplates clinical investigations that are in addition to bioequivalence or bioavailability studies, the requirement for an IND is also governed under 21 CFR 312. Typically, an IND will be needed for clinical studies to support the B2 NDA. I hope that answers that. Yeah, good. I think that's good. And then we'll close with a fairly straightforward question. Is a paper NDA still possible under 505B2? Well, yeah, they are possible. They're rare. I think we've worked in the past few years on a number of projects where the vast majority, if not all, of the support for an NDA came from the published literature. I would suspect that as FDA begins to look hard at some of these under its enforcement initiatives, at some of the approved drugs that remain illegally on the market, the use of extensive literature searches could be used by drug makers that wish to secure formal approval under 505(b)(2). So I think they are rare, but there are a number of products that are out there that are, remain on the market, and I think the possibility for paper NDA is certainly still possible.
Okay, very good. Just a couple of items before we close up here. I want to mention that we will email the answers to remaining questions to participants within the next week. Also, I encourage you to take a moment to fill out our survey. That would be helpful. I think you've got a click button on your console to register for the next webinar, which is December 15th and entitled FDA Enforcement, The Cop is Back, How Enhanced Enforcement Can Impact You. So that's it for today. And Joel, thank you very much for your presentation and response to questions. And also thank you to our audience for participating.